Just about time to begin. If you listen to me preach or teach very often, my preference is to take one passage and to cover it really well for an extended period of time. Tonight is kind of the opposite. I think I've got 50 slides with about that many verses. It's a quantity over quality night where I'm trying to just overwhelm you with data points to make the point, and then we'll slow down some more next week and talk about other things. But we're looking at trying to understand what the Bible looked like, especially during this time in between Moses and, say, the time between the Testaments or the New Testament. That's the period we're looking at. Last week, we left off with a couple of conclusions. We do know that early oral stories were passed down from ancient times. People knew things before Moses wrote it down. Okay, that wasn't the first time they'd ever heard of God. We do not know what form the earliest writings took. There was a pair of stone tablets once, but beyond that, we don't know a lot. We do know that some kind of a Moses figure is needed to make sense of what we have. So even if you decide, I don't believe in a guy named Moses, you're still going to need somebody who sounds suspiciously like Moses, who can do the things that Moses did. So it's pretty, for practical reasons, you need either Moses or his brother Shmoses to make that work. We do know that the content of the Pentateuch is authentically dated to the era of the Exodus. I should have added the word some there, to be fair. At least some. I always try to understate things rather than overstate them. At least some of the things in the first 5 books of the Bible. We looked at the Song of the Sea, the song they sang after they crossed the Red Sea, and noticed how that it had all the earmarks of being an authentically old song, rather than something somebody invented later and stuck in there. So at least some of the content, if not all of it, is just as old as it seems to be. We do not know how much editing might have been done by scribes after Moses, which is what we're going to start talking about today. That's kind of where we left off. There was not a Xerox machine where Moses hit print and the first 5 books just came out, right? And it was like that for all of time. There definitely is substantial evidence that there was editing involved, and that's not a bad thing. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. So, first question. What sort of thing was written down during the lifetime of Moses or shortly thereafter? Here are passages that refer to writing, okay, in the time of Moses. Exodus 17:14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Not interested in the context there at all. We just want a little information. There is an idea that things would be written down. Why would they be written down? So that you can recite them to future generations. We wanted a permanent record, God says. Reciting is important because I need to get this point into your head and another idea out of your head. One thing that did not exist at this time was everybody carrying around an Old Testament. Or more precisely, anybody carrying around an Old Testament. Okay? There were some written texts, but it took the form more of like official temple records or official tabernacle records, or something like that, like this. Write this down and stick it somewhere so that you can read it and recite it to Joshua. The only time that people would hear it, they would never read it on their own, even assuming they were literate, would be when someone read these books to them, which is described as happening from time to time in the Bible. Okay? So, there's a little different spin on it. You ever wonder how it is that every so often in the Old Testament, Israel just completely forgets about God? You say, well, how do they do that? I mean, didn't they go to Bible class every morning? No, they didn't, right? I mean, literally the only time you ever heard that story was when somebody got up and read it, or when in your family over dinner you talked about it. So if that wasn't happening, that you couldn't go home to your study Bible and say, well, what should I be doing with my life? And so if the priests especially failed to read the law to them, what they had of it, just passed from memory. Surprisingly easy to do when you think of it that way. Exodus 24:4, another just quick reference. Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. There's lots of these little phrases that are sandwiched in between other things in the text. God will say something, and he'll say, hey, Moses wrote this down, and then it will keep going. Exodus 34:27-28, the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, and neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. So this is a writing of the Ten Commandments specifically on tablets. Where did they go? Anybody know?
In a box.
In the box. After we smashed them once, they end up in the box, right, in the Ark of the Covenant, and then it ends up in the hands of top men in Indiana Jones. Yeah. Somebody got that reference. Yeah, go ahead.
So why said the rest of the people take their tablets up onto the mountain and see?
And download it from the cloud?
Yeah.
Boo, I will say I did a VBS one time where we had the tablets and we're showing the kids the tablets. And several of them are like, that's not what a tablet looks like. You youngins. Numbers 33:2, Moses wrote down their starting places, stage by stage, by command of the Lord, and these are their stages according to their starting places. So this is a good example of the kind of writing you might get where it says, here's what he wrote down, and then you keep reading, it's what he wrote down. Right? So the description is, how are the people arranged during the book of Numbers? Where would you find the tribes? So chapter 33 says, Moses wrote down where the people were, and then if you read the next 20 verses, it tells you where all the people were. Okay? So that would be an example of the kind of written record. It's not thrilling reading, right? It's not a great novel. It's court records. I mean, it's the kind of records, logistical records, of a whole bunch of people traveling across the wilderness. It's the kind of stuff you'd want to have written down. Deuteronomy 31:9, then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. So who were the custodians of the written texts? Primarily the priests. The elders of tribes may have had some kind of access, but primarily, if something got written down, priests were probably literate, so they were entrusted with, hey, hang on to that so we don't lose it. Okay? And that's where writings would have been. 31:22, so Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the people of Israel. So we gave the example last time of the Song of the Sea. How was that passed down? Well, it was written down, and people learned the song, and they sang it. It's not accidental. The biggest book in the Bible is a songbook, right? Is it something you can memorize, even if you don't have a paper copy in front of you? I bet you guys could give me a pretty good facsimile of Amazing Grace right now if I asked you to write out the lyrics without anything in front of you. But you know how that goes. Right? So songs were a powerful tool in an age when writing was rare. Deuteronomy 31:24-26. When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carry the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, so the Ten Commandments themselves, the tablets are in the covenant box. But that's not all Moses wrote. And what happened to the other stuff? He said, well, I don't know, store it next to the Ark, to the Levites. Sons of Korah, I think, were the ones who kept the Ark of the Covenant, and they would have kept track of that. It's also interesting about this. When Moses had finished writing the words of the law, this law, in a book, to the very end. How do you write that exactly? How do you write, and when I was finished writing this book, this is what I did with it. Right? So again, back to the idea of, were there successive layers of editing where people said, here's a detail you need to know? I think at the direction of God. I don't think it was just happenstance. I think as moved by God's Spirit, there were scribes who said, Well, we probably need to tell people what happened next. And they said, okay, when Moses was done, here's what we did with the book. Okay, and that does not shatter my opinion of the Bible in any way. If anything, it seems fairly reliable. They took care of the book. Okay. So, early conclusions. What do we know about the writings? Moses wrote some things. Priests were the earliest custodians of the writings. We don't have a special class of librarians yet. I'm sorry, ladies. We don't have a special group of people. We barely have literate people. So the priests are scribes. There are librarians. They're the groundskeepers for the tabernacle. They're a little bit of everything. Okay, they catch it all. Kind of like librarians, come to think of it. You do it all. Okay, so what about after Moses? We often refer to the Old Testament collectively as the Law of Moses, but only the first 5 books are even attributed to him. Everything else, the last thing that happens in Deuteronomy is he dies. So what happens after that? 3 passages out of Deuteronomy set the stage for what happens next. Which is perfect, right? It's the last book of Moses, and there's 3 passages that says, now here's what's going to happen next as far as writing goes. The first one is Deuteronomy 12:32, which will sound familiar to you, I'm betting. Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take from it. Is that a pretty familiar warning in your Bible? Don't go tinkering with this book, right? It's a warning repeated in the book of Revelation. If you take anything from this or add to it, added to you the curses of the scroll, right? Don't go tinkering with the book. So, rule 1 out of Deuteronomy, notice the order. Deuteronomy 12, the very end, at chapter 12, don't go tinkering with the book. Does that mean no one will ever say anything again? No. Because the next chapter starts like this, chapter 13, 1 through 5. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. That prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord your God. Okay? So almost the very next verse says, okay, hypothetically, another person comes along, and he seems like a prophet. He checks out. But what he says is, go after a different God than what Moses taught us. That sounds suspiciously like tinkering with the book. Right? Moses says, you got to keep all these commandments, don't add, don't take away. Serving another God definitely falls under the tinkering with the book category. That's not listening to Moses. So if the first rule was don't go tinkering with the book, the second rule was, even if a prophet comes along, if he disagrees with Moses, don't listen to that prophet. In fact, kill that prophet. Okay, not a lot of tolerance there for false prophets. And then a couple of chapters later, in chapter 18, we get a third rule. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. And if you say, this is basically the first rule, right? If you hear a false prophet, he says, go serve other gods, kill him. Okay? And if you say in your heart, how may we know the word the Lord has not spoken? We know what you said to Moses. How do we know that you didn't say something? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. So the third rule is the prophet himself has to kind of pass inspection. Even if he said it in God's name. Even if he said, I'm here to tell you to worship the God of Moses. But he's saying things about the future or signs that do not come to pass. God says, well, that's not my prophet. Because if I say it, it happens. Does that make sense? So, what are the basic rules? Okay, rule number 0 would be don't tinker with the book. Rule number 1 is if a prophet looks legitimate but says let's go after other gods, put him to death. And then rule number 2, if a prophet speaks words that do not come to pass or come true, that is a word the Lord has not spoken. This is the passage I think of anytime I think about people today who anticipate the end of the world and make multiple end times prophecies. In my opinion, everybody's allowed one. Right? If you want to guess once, go for it. But when you're wrong the first time, move on, right? Because God says, hey, it doesn't come to pass. It wasn't for me. So everybody gets one. Isaac Newton predicted the end of the world in like 2542. He was smart enough to say it's about 1,000 years in the future. So he could still be right. We're waiting on that, right? But people who are multiple times wrong in their own lifetime, Moses says, don't be worried about that guy. That's not how God speaks to us. Okay? So, now apply that to our question, what happens after Moses is done writing? Did we just accept anything that anybody wrote and said, yeah, God said this too? No. First, we stuck with whatever Moses said. That was set in stone, almost literally in the form of tablets, right? That was done. And then we checked, does it teach us to go and serve God the same way Moses did? And then we say, does it say things that are also true, that come to pass? Does it check out as a prophet? Okay. So, I think every text that follows after Moses kind of applies this test, and that they looked at it and said, okay, does that check out? Did other prophets write after the time of Moses? Joshua, this is the end of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 26. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. Big tree next to it. Like he doesn't even put it with Moses' books. It's under the tree next to Moses' books. But he writes it and he calls it in the book of the law of the Lord. Okay? So Joshua wrote something and it got added. That's what I'm supposed to add. Well, it's not adding in the sense of changing anything. It was just a history since the time of Moses. He didn't invent commandment number 11. He just said, here's what happened next. Okay. And so they would have looked at that. Did it change anything that Moses wrote? No. Did he tell us through other gods? No. Did he do a good job as a leader and do signs that a prophet would do that check out? Yep. Okay. So Joshua's in your body. And that seems to be the process. 1 Samuel 10:25, then Samuel told the people the rights and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. Where do you suppose that is? Laid it up before the Lord. Tabernacle, some place of worship. That might have been Bethel or some other place, I don't know, but they went to a place of worship. Hey, the priest, Samuel has written this. It's something that God is giving us. Keep track of it for us. Then Samuel sent all people away to his own home. So again, you didn't go home with copies of the Bible. They stayed in a centralized location. Such writings as there were kind of centralized. If you skip ahead to the other end of the kingdom years, Jeremiah 36, 1 through 4, in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Take a scroll and write on it all the words that I have spoken to you. It goes on a bit. Then Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote on a scroll at the dictation of Jeremiah all the words that he had spoken to him. There's a little more there, but I'll read it later. So here we have, again, another example. Prophets given a prophecy of God. He says, hey, let's write this down. This is the first time we get this new idea. Baruch writes dictation. This is a guy who has a specialty. He is a guy who is a writer by trade. He took notes. So we come to call these kind of folks scribes. Okay? By the time you get to the New Testament, it's a whole class of people that Jesus can say the scribes and the priests and the different. It's a whole group of people. But in ancient times, that was a pretty new profession. So who were these scribes and what were they allowed to do? The Bible speaks pretty positively about scribes. Psalm 45:1, my heart overflows with pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You got hymns talking about how great scribes are. You know, my song's almost as good as a scribe wrote it. So I think pretty highly of scribes, no problem there. 1 Chronicles 2:55. The clans also of the scribes who lived at Jabez, the Kerethites, the Shemathites, and the Sukkothites, these are the Kenites who came from Hamath, the father of the house of Rechab. You knew it was scribes because they list all their names. They were the guys who could spell. So here, these are the clans of the scribes. Right? So we have swelling numbers of kind of a professional cast of people who could keep track of books. Jeremiah, again, this is more in that same chapter we were in a moment ago with Baruch. Then Jeremiah took another scroll and gave it to Baruch the scribe, son of Neriah. And every time it's a scribe, now let me give you all my names. You can tell scribes, right? Who wrote on it at the dictation of Jeremiah all the words of the scroll that Jehoiakim of Judah had burned in the fire. So if you read the Jeremiah story, Jeremiah gives his prophecy. Jehoiakim, not thrilled, puts Jeremiah in a dungeon, sets the scroll on fire. We'll show him, we'll write it again. So he goes and gets Baruch, and Baruch takes dictation, I guess while Jeremiah's in the dungeon, and they reproduce the book of Jeremiah. Did the scribes change or edit the texts? And the answer is yes or no. In fact, some of both. This is the same verse. This is the part I didn't read. Took another scroll, dictation of Jeremiah, and many similar words were added to them. And the text just says, and then we wrote some more. Okay, now it doesn't spell out. Does that mean Jeremiah just went on a bit, or did Baruch add some? It just says we added more words. And it's not a secret, like there's some kind of clandestine guild out there editing your Bible. I think that's the way it's presented on the internet. There were these people who change the Bible to their whim. It tells you in the book, and then we added some stuff. If they're trying to hide it, they're doing a terrible job. Because they told you, and then we added some stuff. Not only that, you can see some good examples. I've mentioned this one now, I think, both weeks, but here's one clear example. Genesis 14:14. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Okay. What's wrong with that verse? Who is Dan? Better yet, who is Dan's father? Okay, so he is the son of Jacob. Jacob's father was Isaac, and Isaac's father was... So how is there a city named after his great-grandson at this time? That doesn't make any sense at all. In fact, the Bible even tells you how the city got its name, and it wasn't even in the time of Dan. In Joshua 19:47, during the conquest, the people of Dan, that's the tribe, not Dan. Dan's not alive. He hasn't been alive for a long time. The tribe of Dan, that been in Egypt and back and now conquered, went up and fought against Leshem. They took possession of it and settled it, calling Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor. Okay? So it wasn't called Dan then. It was probably called Leshem, right? And then years later, the city was called Dan. What did the scribe do? The scribe says, nobody knows what Leshem is. Abraham went as far as Dan. And it just helps you out with some geography. Does anyone think the fundamental doctrines of God's Word have been undermined by this geographical city name being out of order or anything? Not only am I appreciative of it, it actually helps, right, to know that they updated the maps once in a while. That was what a scribe would do. It makes sense. Furthermore, the Jewish people through the centuries after this, now this, what I'm going to refer to isn't from this era we're talking about, but later on, actually wrote down things they changed. Okay, if it's a secret, nefarious plot, they're doing a terrible job because they have a book called Tikkun Seferim, which means changes the scribes made. Kid you not, it's the name of the book. Edits the scribes made. And it lists the things that the scribes knew they had changed, so that future generations would know we tinkered with this part. I don't know if they listed every, like I would say, they didn't list every single thing, but whatever point in history they got to start writing that book, they realized we should keep track of these. And they got pretty methodical about it. They had rules for how to make a scroll. You had to memorize the rules before you were allowed to be a scribe. If you couldn't recite them, they didn't hire you. It contains the text of the Torah itself, all the rules concerning decorative flourishes, regulations on spacing, how to make the line straight, how many letters per line. It was numbered. So how do you know you did it right? You didn't look at the words and say, did I get those words right? You counted letters on each line. And if it had the right number of letters, you did it right. Okay, so pretty meticulous. The scribe writing a Torah scroll is forbidden to rely on memory and has to write from a copy. So you couldn't just say, I'm pretty sure I remember that part. Had to have it right in front of you, letter for letter, and count the letters. When writing a Torah scroll, a scribe must prepare himself to write the names of the Lord with proper devotion and ritual purity. Anytime you came to God's name, you're supposed to stop and prepare yourself. It was customary that he immerse himself in a ritual bath before beginning his work. Okay? And one of the reasons we don't have old Hebrew manuscripts is because they intentionally got rid of them. If a text began to deteriorate, rather than have possibility of losing the piece and missing the letter, they gave it a ceremonial burial, and they got rid of it. And they only kept the newest, cleanest copies, meticulously compared, before they committed one to burial. So we don't have any old ones because they purged them, rather than risk having a damaged one stay in circulation. I went and looked up some examples of things that the scribes acknowledged that they tinkered with, and here's a couple of examples. Saul's son is named Eshbaal. In Hebrew, that literally means Baal exists. What a great name, right? Baal exists. The one thing I'm pretty sure can't be true, right? If you're Jewish. In Chronicles, they still call it Ishbaal, but in the Samuel books, he's called Ishbosheth, and Bosheth means shame. So the scribes came back and said, we're tired of calling him Baal exists. We're going to name him, he's a man of shame. And they amended his name. Same thing happens to Saul's grandson, who's named Baal, which means Baal fights for us, like Baal is our champion. They changed it to Mephibosheth, one who destroys shame or shame no more. Right? We're glad the shame is out of our history. So they acknowledge it in the text. Like, we changed this name, and they tell you why. You don't have to guess why. It was an embarrassing name to have to read aloud. And then Baal exists, came down to the house of God. Right? It was an embarrassing thing, so they changed it. Okay. A couple other examples, they change just because they felt it was awkward to read. Remember, the primary way people interacted with the text was reading it out loud. So I noticed, I didn't jot this one down, but there's one text where the person speaking shouts to the crowd, "Go to your gods." Well, the person in the temple reading the text felt uncomfortable saying, "Go to your gods," to a room full of Jewish people. And so they changed it to "Go to your tents." Not because it was bad that guy said it, it's because I don't want to repeat what he said in the temple. Go to your gods. Another example, 1 Samuel 3:13. Because his sons did bring a curse upon themselves, the actual text said they cursed God, as in they blasphemed God. But the guy reading it didn't want to say the words blaspheme God in the temple. And so they adjusted to where it says they brought a curse on themselves. And that's most of the changes that they acknowledge related to God's name or something that bugged them that might have been misunderstood by the people if it was read in the wrong way. Another example, Zechariah 2:12. God says, "Whoever touches you," Israel, "whoever touches Israel touches the apple of my eye." The scribes got thinking about that. Do you mean if you hurt Israel, you can jab God in the eye? Does God have eyes? Can you jab God in the eye? Like that imagery bothered them. So in the amended version of the text, it says, you'll poke your own eye out. Right? Because they just didn't like the idea of saying you could hurt God. So you can see the kind of changes they made. They're very subtle. It's mostly based around, I'm nervous about reading this out loud in a temple setting. I think someone might misunderstand. There was one writing in one of the texts of the rabbis I was looking at that said, I know Moses said don't change the words, but it would be better to change a word than to blaspheme God by mistake. That was his concern. And so as a person who read publicly, he said, we'll take the safe route. They were very concerned about reverence, especially in the temple setting. So those are the kind of things that the editors edited. Okay? Usually, the changes consist of one or two letters. Like if they could find a way to move a letter and smooth something out, they would. But we're not changing paragraphs. We're not inventing stories. We're smoothing out sentences for the sake of public reading. What do we know then about these writings between Moses and the end of the Old Testament history? A couple of things. How much time I've got time. Writings definitely existed, but we know they were intermittently ignored or forgotten during the era of the kings. Okay? How did that happen? The priests didn't read it. Nobody ever heard it. Writings existed and were consulted during the era of the Babylonian Persian exile and were used to understand what was happening. In fact, this is actually kind of normal. When things are going well, they forget the books are there. When things are going badly, somebody get out the books. We need to figure out what's going on. So Babylon is as bad as it gets. And so suddenly they are digging through the books. What are we supposed to do now? There's lots of references there. And then the writings existed and were attended by scribes after the exile. Let's give you some information on that. This from 2 Kings 22, 8 through 10. And Hilkiah the priest said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan and he read it. Shaphan the secretary came to the king and reported to the king, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Then Shaphan the secretary told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book, and Shaphan read it before the king. And then there's a whole chapter about this book they found. I love this story because of the details, right? The first guy, the priest, is doing priestly things, right? How often did the priest interact with the Ark of the Covenant?
Once a year.
Yeah. So there were things in the temple that you didn't see on a daily basis. And Hilkiah kind of stumbles onto this book. Where had it been? In one of those other passages we read, it said stick it next to the Ark of the Covenant. I don't know if that's where it stayed or if it was a special shelf somewhere, but there were these books, and he kind of stumbles onto it. Now imagine this, you're a priest, your one job is to take care of the books and read them every so often, and you find the book that says, please take care of me and read me every so often. And you don't even recognize it. You didn't know this book existed. So he's a little troubled. He passes it off to his secretary, whatever that means. The person, the liaison between him and the king. The secretary is not even amused. He gives him the financial report. Says, all right, here's how much we spent this month. Here's what's going on. Oh, by the way, the priest found a book. And it's like as an afterthought, and he gave me this book. The priest thinks this is really trouble. The secretary's like, I don't know what this is. Here you go. And then when you read it, they read it before the king. Shaphan read it before the king. I don't know if the king's even literate, right? So you're reading it to the king, and he realizes this is kind of a big deal. This is the book we were supposed to be reading every so often to know what to do. Maybe that's why we're in so much trouble right now. So it seems like that probably happened quite often through the history of Israel. Like that's the most famous one of finding the law. But it does, if you read the book of Judges, it's just like they forget God every so often. And then it makes sense that maybe they went and said, seems like we had a book about this. And then we go consult. This demonstrates the existence of a written book prior to this time period. Also suggests the writings have been ignored for an extended period of time. These writings seem to anticipate consequences for ignoring God's writings. And so when you found them, you were concerned. So for example, Isaiah 44, 24 and following, Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself, who frustrates the signs of liars and makes fools of diviners, who turn wise men's back and makes their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers. Stop there. That's Deuteronomy 13 and 18 again, right? The false prophet will speak presumptuously and it won't come to pass. My prophet, his word will come to pass. So what does God say? I'm the one who makes false prophets liars and true prophets true prophets. I'm that God. Who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited. And of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise up their ruins. Who says to the deep, be dry, I will dry up your rivers. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. It's a couple different interpretations of Isaiah, and this is not an Isaiah class, so I'm not going to talk about them. But either this is written in Isaiah's lifetime, okay? So imagine if I preached a sermon on Sunday and said, and I promise you, Ada will be rebuilt. Still here. What are you anticipating is going to happen? Right? That's kind of frightening. It's a frightening promise. Don't worry, I'll repair Ada. That sounds like you're going to destroy it. And that's what it sounds like. Don't worry, I'll rebuild Jerusalem. Aren't we standing in Jerusalem? Mm-hmm. And then even further, Cyrus is my shepherd. It's a Persian name. It's not a Hebrew name, not even a Babylonian name. It's a strange foreign name. I've already picked out a guy who's going to take care of things. So again, if I said, I will rebuild the city of Ada, and Vladimir will be there to help. The Russians are coming? What does that mean? That's a very confusing prophecy. So either it's way in advance and really mysterious, or it could have been written sometime after Isaiah, which is another theory, and still somewhat mysterious. You know, what does this mean? They're trying to understand what's God doing. But of note, the name of Cyrus appears in the text. Jeremiah 25:12. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. This is the time of the exile. You're going into captivity, you'll be there 70 years, and then I'm going to spring you by punishing the Babylonian king. The reason I read those two passages is because later, that's what happens. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons till the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Right? So, the end of the history says, and then it happened, what happened? Exactly the thing that Jeremiah told us was probably going to happen, in the number of years that Jeremiah said it would take to happen. When those years come about, towards the end, Daniel 9, 1 and 2, in the first year of Darius, the king of Ahasuerus, by descent of Mede, who was made king over the realms of the Chaldean, first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of desolations of Jerusalem in the 70 years. He says, I was sitting here in Babylon trying to figure out what's going on, and I went and I read the books. What books? He named the book Jeremiah wrote before we got here. I went and consulted it. Jeremiah said we'd be here 70 years, and I can count. 70 years are up. I expected something to start happening. In Ezra 1, in the first year of Cyrus, there's his name, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, also putting it in writing, and then Ezra records the proclamation that Cyrus made in writing. Okay. So what you see here for the first time is an interconnectedness of the writings. Later writers referring to earlier writers and saying, yeah, I have read Jeremiah. This is what we saw before. So there is an accumulation of texts at this point. Ezra becomes really important because he is the leader of the people at this time. He's close to Cyrus, and he's a scribe. My librarian's going to like this. So imagine we make a librarian president. Okay. What do you think happens to national funding for libraries? Okay. Ezra's in charge of Israel, and he's a scribe. Guess what? We made some books. Okay. And they get to write. So, things we can say so far. The compiler of Chronicles and of Ezra are aware of Jeremiah. Cyrus, for whatever reason, is under the impression that the God of heaven has charged him to rebuild the temple. Right? I don't know why I got that idea. Daniel, who knew Cyrus, was familiar with the writings of the prophets, including Jeremiah and possibly Isaiah, and said, I want to write the books. This is what's supposed to happen. So these books exist in some form. The version of the Old Testament we have is likely the result of the work of Ezra and his fellow scribes after the period of exile. How do I know that? Because Ezra tells us so, but that's pretty much how it happened. The important chapter is Ezra 7. Ezra is in like the second wave of people going back to Jerusalem. After this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, how do you know he's a scribe? He's going to give you his family tree. Ezra, the son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Marioth, son of Zariah, son of Uzai, son of Bukai, son of Abushua, son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the chief priest. This Ezra. There's never been a sentence more scribe-like than that one, right? Which Ezra? This one. Here's my entire family tree, all the way back to Aaron, the chief priest. So he's closely connected to the rulers in Persia that they're leaving. He's a descendant of Aaron, so he's a priest, and he's a scribe. Okay? He's our guy. He's going to put things in order here. He was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses, the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. So again, librarian is president, and then someone else gives them an unlimited budget. Right? Okay. We're going to make some books. So he says, anything you want, I'll give you. Here comes the books. And there went up also to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king, some of the people of Israel, some of the priests and the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, the temple servants. And I love this. He gives you his ancestors back to Aaron. And then he says, and there were some priests and some Levites and singers and gatekeepers and people. They were there too. But Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was the 7th year of the king. All these guys, they showed up. Ezra in the 5th month, in the 7th year, and he dates it, I described it. On the 1st day of the 1st month, he began to go up to Babylonia, and on the 1st day of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem, for the good hand of his God was on him, for Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach its statutes and rules in Israel. I'm going to go to this book. Okay? How do I know this is Ezra writing this? Stay with me. In case it weren't obvious, stay with me. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. And then he recites the letter. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, peace. And now, and recites for several more verses the entire letter. Right? This guy loves to write. And so he's reproducing an entire letter that someone else sent him. And then he really gives it away at the end. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king to beautify the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, to extend it to me, what? To me, his steadfast love before the king and his counselors and before all the king's mighty officers. I took courage, for the hand of the Lord my God was on me, and I gathered leading men from Israel over me. Yeah. So before it was, boy, Ezra, isn't Ezra great? And by the end of the chapter, it's me. It's me. It's me. I wrote this. So it's kind of comically funny to me, and also very serious. This is our guy. This is a guy who was in the same way Moses was in the right place, the right time, exactly where God needed him to be to get the people out of Egypt and to produce the law. Ezra is the other bookhead. He's the right guy in the right place to produce a compiled set of these texts that have come to them through the years. And I think by and large, that's the Old Testament we have is the product of Ezra and his group. That a lot of it's earlier than that. With the compilation, the editing, when in doubt, I said, Ezra probably did that, and I move on. And I don't lose any sleep over it, because it seems like Ezra knew what he was doing. Nehemiah mentions the same thing. And all the people gathered as one man to the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses the Lord had commanded Israel. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, both men and women and all who could understand what they heard on the first day of the 7th month, and he read from it facing the square before the water gate from early morning until midday. I give the scripture reader more than 10 verses, I get a glare. But he reads all morning in the presence of the men, the women, and those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so the people understood the reading. So they read it, interpreted it, explained, this is the book, here's where we're going from here. Okay.
That's why you get eyes, and you don't do that last.
I don't do that last part, I don't tell you what it means. I'm just like, I'm just going to figure it out. Conclusions then, and then questions. Priests and scribes such as Ezra were the custodians of the scriptures. Okay? I have a lot of confidence in them, so I have a lot of confidence in the book. I have a lot of confidence in God who did this. Editors of the scriptures did not have liberty to alter the scriptures upon human whim. Very strictly governed in how they treated the text. That said, did they edit it? Yeah, and they told us they did. They said, that I wrote this part. While the writings existed in some form throughout the kingdom years, the form we have probably dates the period of exile and shortly thereafter. Okay. Joy, you get one question.
Okay, I'm going to save my question because it's really a comment. Slip that in there. I'm so excited that you brought out the Nehemiah chapter 8 because the date is the 7th month, first day, which happens to be starting about now.
About now?
About now,
Nice.
which happens to
That's
be...
why I planned it.
You did, excellent. Which happens to be the Day of Trumpets. So this is a festival day because he knew God's word. He knew it was a feast day. All of this comes about. And then the people are weeping over reading, but he tells them, don't despair with this. The joy of the Lord is your strength. And so it's a beautiful chapter. So go read the whole thing.
Yeah, I really cheated you guys. I have both Ezra 7 and Nehemiah 8 are both just beautiful little stories of people who just get introduced to God's word in a fresh and beautiful way after a long era of not knowing who they were. And it's just a wonderful read. But yeah. Okay. Next week then, we're going to pick up where the prophets stop. We're going to start kind of here. Are these the only books that Jewish people ever wrote? No. The other books belong to a category often called the Apocrypha, or if you're Roman Catholic, the Deuterocanonical books. And next week we'll talk about those. We'll say what's in them, why aren't they in our Bible, and what am I supposed to do with them now? And that'll be, yes, Tom.
The Old Testament canon became like it is for us today without the Maccabees, and includes the minor prophets. Didn't it come about the time of Alexander the Great that they canonized that because the Septuagint does not include the Maccabees, I don't believe, does it?
Next week, I'm going to answer Tom's question anymore. But yeah, it's in that period where things get ironed out. Daniel is one of the books that's challenging, and it's still being argued about by the time of Jesus, although Jesus quotes it. Esther is another book. Again, it would have been one of the last books written, and it's written in a foreign country, so they're not sure about it. So you have a couple of books kind of on the back fringe. Like if the 5 books of Moses are the bedrock, then Daniel and Esther are kind of like the last, okay, we're pretty sure that belongs here. And then next week we get that other group of books that's, no, not these. Good to read, but they weren't included with the rest.
Also, many of the chapters of Isaiah are seem to be equivalent to being after the 1st century or during the 1st century.
After the 1st century?
Or somewhere in that neighborhood.
I wouldn't say added that far. Now, no, because they're quoted in the New Testament. I mean, so they just prior to the 1st century. There is a pretty good argument that I'm not convinced of, but it's a pretty good argument, that there's at least two chunks of Isaiah. The first 39 chapters sound like they were written in the time of a fellow named Isaiah. It's possible that chapters 40 through 66 were written either during the captivity or later. That's the section that names Cyrus by name and gets really strangely specific. So either Isaiah, it wouldn't bother me to say God told Isaiah what was going to happen a century or so in the future in excruciating detail. That's certainly possible. Or second Isaiah, right? Another guy, one of these scribes or another prophet who's not named, pens the rest of that and it's attached during the captivity. That is debated a little bit about which piece goes where. I was just treating them like it's all Isaiah because that's simpler in my brain, but yeah, that's good. You haven't lived until you go to the commentary section and it says the commentary on second Isaiah. Second Isaiah. That won't make out one. Yeah, that's what it is. It'll be the second half. Okay, thanks for your attention. Next week, Apocrypha, Tobit, Demons, and Blindness.
Yay.